Welcome to The Explainer. In this series, we take a look at some really complex, sometimes controversial ideas and try to break them down into something a bit more digestible.
All right, let's just jump right in with a pretty wild question. What if everything you think you know about history is wrong? We're going to be looking at some sources today that seriously challenge the official story, the one we all learned in school. The idea here is that maybe, just maybe, there's a whole other version of the past and a whole different group of people in charge that we're not being told about.
Okay, so our first stop on this journey is a big one. It's this theory about a massive, super advanced global empire that, according to our first source, was completely and totally scrubbed from the history books on purpose.
So, what was this empire? Well, according to this theory, it was a civilization called Great Tartaria. And the claim is that this was a huge worldwide empire. You know all that amazing old world architecture you see everywhere? Like those incredible cathedrals in Europe, or even some of the older, grander government buildings right here in the US. The theory says they built all of it as part of one unified, technologically advanced global culture, a past we've supposedly been forced to forget.
And get this, according to the source, this wasn't some slow decline or a natural fall of an empire. No, the claim here is that it was a deliberate, violent act. As you can see from this quote, the theory alleges that some kind of new world order figured out how to use Tartaria's own technology against them, destroying the entire culture and literally erasing them from history. We're talking about a conscious effort to hide a past that was way more advanced than our present.
This is where it gets really interesting. The theory isn't just about old maps. It claims that a lot of what we think of as 19th century marvels were actually just leftover Tartarian tech. So those pointy spires on old cathedrals, not just for decoration. The idea is they were actually atmospheric energy harvesting towers, basically pulling free energy right out of the air. And things like old insane asylums and grand exhibition halls, well, the theory says they were just repurposed Tartarian buildings, their original much cooler functions totally hidden from us.
So that begs the question, right? If this incredible civilization was wiped out, who did it? Well, that brings us to our next set of sources. They argue that the group responsible didn't just stop back then. In fact, they claim the same hidden network is still pulling the strings, engineering our entire society from the shadows, even today.
And here's the name they give this group, the Committee of 300. Sometimes it's also called the Black Nobility. The sources describe them as this super elite club of the most powerful people on the planet. And they're not new to the game. The idea is they've been around for centuries, secretly directing everything: global politics, the media, the world's money supply, all from behind a curtain.
And look, this idea isn't just pulled from thin air. This quote really nails it. And it's not from some fringe blogger. It's from Edward Bernays, a guy literally known as the father of public relations. When he talks about an invisible government being the true ruling power, the sources we're looking at say he wasn't just being poetic. They argue he was describing the literal truth, a system where what we think, what we buy, and who we vote for is all carefully manufactured for us.
So how do they build this system of control? Well, according to these sources, you can actually map it out. This timeline highlights a few key moments. You've got the secret meeting on Jekyll Island that led to the Federal Reserve. You have the birth of mass media propaganda during World War I. And then the creation of these powerful think tanks like the Tavistock Institute and the Council on Foreign Relations. Each one of these is presented not as a random historical event, but as a deliberate brick being laid in the wall of modern social engineering.
Okay, so if this invisible government exists, how exactly do they do it? How do they keep control? Well, according to the sources, it's all about propaganda. They don't need to use force when they can just manufacture your reality for you.
Let's look at a couple of big examples. Take the sinking of the Lusitania. The official story is that it was an unprovoked attack that pulled the US into World War I. But these sources claim it was actually a contrived situation, a setup designed to make Americans angry enough to support the war. Or how about the 1929 stock market crash? Not just a tragic economic accident, they say, but a planned event, engineered to wipe out the middle class and concentrate all the wealth and power in the hands of a few.
And the point here is that this isn't just a one-off thing. It's a systematic playbook. The tools are all around us. We're talking about public opinion polls that aren't just measuring what you think, but actually shaping what you think. They fund think tanks to give an academic-sounding stamp of approval to policies they already wanted. They even allegedly create social turbulences, major cultural upheavals, and then use the media to keep us all in a state of constant anxiety or shell shock, which makes us way easier to manage.
So, if there's a playbook for the powerful, is there a playbook for the rest of us, for the resistance? Well, that's where our sources bring in a very different kind of figure, Saul Alinsky. His book, Rules for Radicals, is often seen as the ultimate guide for how to fight back against the system.
Now, Alinsky's approach is, let's just say, it's very practical. Some would even call it ruthless. It's basically a manual for how the have-nots can take power from the haves. And as you can see from this quote, he's pretty clear that when you're in a real fight for power, the old rules of fair play don't always apply. The end justifies the means.
So, what does that look like in practice? Well, here are some of his key tactics. It's all about being clever. You do things your enemy doesn't expect. You poke and prod them until they freak out and overreact, which makes them look bad. You force them to live up to their own impossibly high standards. And, maybe the most famous one, you use ridicule. Because as he says, it's one of the most powerful weapons there is. It's basically a guide to political guerrilla warfare.
All right, so we've got these huge theories about secret rulers and this tactical playbook for radicals. What does any of this have to do with, well, right now? Let's try to connect the dots. We're going to look at a debate that's happening all the time, public assistance or food stamps, and see if we can spot any of these ideas in the wild. Okay, so look at how the debate over something like food stamps is framed. You've got these two very different stories. On one side, you hear that it's not about individuals, it's about giant corporations not paying their workers enough, so taxpayers have to pick up the slack. On the other side, the story is all about government waste and people cheating the system. Now think back to what we just talked about. Could the first argument be a classic Alinsky tactic, making the haves live up to their own rules by pointing out corporate welfare? And could the focus on fraud be a way to create that social turbulence, that anxiety that makes people question the whole system? When you look at it through this lens, it stops being just a simple disagreement about policy. It becomes a full-on war for your heart and mind. And so after all of this, we're left with a pretty tough question, aren't we? If these sources are even partially right, if our history has been manipulated and our politics are just a series of power plays, then how do you ever find out what's actually true? It presents a world where the real challenge isn't just finding the right answers. The real challenge is figuring out if you can even trust the questions you're being told to ask.